Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Professor Pride podcast. I am, of course, your host, Professor Pride. And today on the show, we're going to be talking about the anti-LGBTQ bills that are being proposed across the country of the United States right now. And believe it or not, as odd as it may sound, it's actually somewhat of a good thing to see so many bills coming out in January, just because it means they didn't pass last year. So we're going to be talking about that in just a second. So bear with me. It's not a good thing that so many anti-LGBTQ bills exist. It's just a good thing that they're coming out right now because it means 2023 was a fail for them. Okay? So if you're looking at all the bills that are coming out right now, you might be, like me, looking at the ACLU website where they track all of these different bills across the country. And right now, there's an alarming number of them. Like last year, we saw that there was a total, all last year of 2023, 540 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed across the country all last year. This year, 417 so far, and it's February 14th when I'm recording this. So that's not great to see, right? I mean, to see that there's so many just in 2 months alone, not even 2 months already, but last year there was 540, you might think that's 77% of what we had all last year, and we're only in February. So you can imagine the number that we would see by the end of December of 2024 if we already have 417 bills proposed now. And while that's true, it's horrible to see so many bills across the country. A couple things you may not realize are happening here with these bills specifically. So the way any kind of bill works is they have to be introduced. And if they do not come up for a vote or they do not pass in one year, one legislative year, they can be proposed again the next legislative year. So you're starting to see where I'm going with this. Last year, 540 anti-LGBTQ bills were proposed across the country, right? Now, some of them passed, like we saw the Don't Say Gay law in Florida. We see, education being ripped from the hands of students across, all of Florida and a couple different states. You see anti-drag bills actually being passed across the Tennessee and stuff like that. But for the most part, these bills are not passing. So what happens if they don't pass? Well, for instance here, let's look at the Equality Act, the Federal Equality Act, right? It was proposed many years ago. It protects the basic human rights of every single LGBTQ person across the country. And it says that the government in all capacities has to treat LGBTQ people fairly and equally to cis and straight individuals, right? That's a great thing. However, there's two things that can happen with that. First off, it can go to the floor of the House and the Senate for a vote, and if it doesn't pass, some legislator could say in January of the following year, I'm going to propose that bill again. I'm going to amend a few things and just propose the bill again to see if maybe it works this time, right? But if the House Speaker or the Senate Speaker decide they don't like the bill in any capacity, they could decide, hey, we're just not going to put this for a vote at all. For example here, the House of Representatives passed the Equality Act a few times, right? Then it went to the Senate. The Senate of the United States government at the time of this was led by the majority leader, Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell doesn't like the Equality Act because it doesn't align with his party. So he decided not even to bring it for a vote. It didn't matter how many people supported it. It didn't matter how many people were against it. It only mattered what Mitch McConnell, one person, thought of this bill. So he said, hey, I don't like this. Doesn't matter if it would pass or not. I'm not going to bring it for a vote. in the US Senate. So it never became a law because one person in the Senate, one senator out of the 100 senators said, I don't like this. That doesn't sound fair. It's not. Let's just face it, right? Everything should come to a vote by the House and the Senate. At least let the majority rule. Don't let one person control everything. Now, across the country, there are some majority leaders in the House or the Senate of different states that are controlled by Democrats. And so what you'll see is the same thing in reverse. You'll see the majority leader saying, hey, I don't like this bill, so we're not even going to bring it to a vote, right? So it just sits there. It's a bill just standing there for all time. Now, what happens every December 31st in the United States is every single bill expires. No matter, if they were about to come to a vote, no matter what. If it didn't come to a vote yet and it didn't pass, if it fails a vote, or if it wasn't even put up for a vote, every single bill fails. Like, it just stops existing. You can still look it up online, of course, but it just ceased to exist. So let's say you propose a bill December 31st, which typically doesn't happen, but let's say you propose one on December 31st, 2023. That bill, no matter what, expires at midnight. So January 1st, you have to reintroduce that bill all over again, right? And that does not matter what the bill is about, doesn't matter if it's LGBTQ or not, right? It has to be reproposed to the House and the Senate January 1st. So, for the 540 anti-LGBTQ bills across the country that were proposed last year, some of them passed, some of them failed. But January 1st, all of a sudden you see hundreds of bills being introduced across the country. And so, while technically the ACLU is right on this, that 417 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced in 2024 so far. That is 100% accurate. However, that doesn't include the fact or the caveat, a little description, that most of those were reintroduced from last year. So if a bill failed last year, if it was voted down last year, if it was not even brought up for a vote last year in that state, it can be reintroduced on the 1st of January 2024. And so that's what happened for a majority of these. Now, we can sit here and debate how many of those bills will actually pass this year in 2024. Not a whole lot of them will, hopefully. However, the good part of this is to see how many bills are coming back. How many bills are being reintroduced. That's why we see, spikes through the years. We did a whole graph on our website, professorpride.com, on this of, back in 2018, there were, less than 50 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed. Then, by 2020, you see about 100 being proposed across the country. 2021, you have about 250 being proposed. 2022, you have about 300 anti-LGBTQ bills being proposed across the country. And finally, in 2023, you see 540, which is a huge spike. And you see this gradual increase in how many anti-LGBTQ bills are introduced. What is not told to the public is how many of those were introduced year after year. Because as I'm sitting here looking through the data for this year, and that's why we're making this podcast episode, is because a lot of these bills that are now proposed, the 417, I recognize from previous years. I've read these bills before, the exact language. It's just now having a different HB number or an SB number, which is a House Bill 130 or a Senate Bill 96, Basically, as you reintroduce a bill on January 1st, it gets a brand new number as if it never existed before, even though it can be the same exact language as a previous bill last year, right? So basically what we're seeing is this gradual increase in how many anti-LGBTQ bills are introduced every year. What's not told is how many were reintroduced from the previous year and the previous year and the previous year. So if something fails in 2018, a lot of them did. A lot of them did fail in 2018. So they get reintroduced January 1st, 2019. Now they count as an anti-LGBTQ bill proposed in 2018 and 2019 because it failed and it was reintroduced in 2019. So then it fails again. It's reintroduced 2020. And so now it counts in 2020 again. And now more and more we see these bills failing and they're reintroduced. And so yes, it's alarming to see 417 across the country, but it's also kind of good news to see how many of them are failing. This means 400 bills basically failed last year to pass, and they have to be reintroduced again and again and again. That means, at the very least, the House chair of, like, the House Speaker or the Majority Leader in the Senate don't want these bills to come to the floor for a vote. That could be for a number of reasons. It could be because they don't think it's going to pass. They may not have the votes to pass it, with the filibuster and everything included. They could also just not agree with the bill themselves personally, and they say, hey, we don't want this bill to even come to the floor for a vote. You might have the votes to pass it, but I don't want it, so I'm going to stop it right here and now. In all fairness, that's not the way things should work in a democracy, if one person is able to stop anything, but in some instances it's good, other instances we see bad things like the Equality Act not coming to a vote. So you kind of have to take the good with the bad of how our system works. It's not a total democracy here. But I will say, at the very least, it's good to see some bills are failing. They're having to be reintroduced year after year after year. So right now, all we can do is we can take a look at these bills, take a look at what they're coming after. Mostly, they're coming after transgender rights, okay? That's alarming for the trans community. It's sadly not as concerning to other members of our community. Last year we did a study on our internal issues in the LGBTQ. You can read all about that study. We published our entire report on professorpride.com. You can go check that out now. But in it, we asked the LGBTQ community, what were some of the problems you see in our community? What do you think about our community associating ourselves with, like, lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals associating with transgender and queer individuals? What do you think about sexual orientations being closely aligned with gender identity? Overwhelmingly, we saw a response that was concerning, to say the least, where back in the Stonewall Riots days, you have a lot of our community standing together and saying, hey, we all want rights equally here. You see, we did episodes on our other channel, Powered by Rainbows, where we talk about how the LGBTQ, the African American rights in our country, and how women's rights kind of all went together back in the 60s, 70s, 1960s and 70s. And so you saw certain groups getting equal rights and protections under the law, at least. Our country is still, racist and sexist and everything, horrible in the world. But you see, at the very least on a federal level or a state level, things have changed for certain communities. The LGBTQ is still far behind that. Out of the LGBTQ, gay rights have come a long way. I would love it to be protected under the law for my marriage with my husband, to say that we have a valid marriage according to the federal government. Right now, all that says that is a Supreme Court decision that can be reversed at any time. We've seen this with Roe v. Wade. That was what was so concerning about Roe v. Wade, by the way, is we saw a precedent set by the Supreme Court. A decision made by the Supreme Court was reversed. And with it, Justice Scalia, or one of the justices, said in their statement that we should be looking at Obergefell v. Hodges, which is the entire case validating marriage between the same gender. That's my marriage. Like, if they overturned Obergefell v. Hodges, that would undo, like, a lot of marriages across the country. For instance, in Pennsylvania, luckily we have a decision that was made at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that would sort of step in there if it needed to, if the Obergefell v. Hodges failed. But a lot of states don't have that. A lot of states have fail-safe laws. Basically, it means, or trigger laws, where basically you have a federal decision by the Supreme Court being overruled, and as soon as that happens, a state's law is enacted that would invalidate every marriage across the entire state. So you see this kind of thing happening where Supreme Court really isn't sticking to their decisions anymore, unfortunately. And so I would love it to be in law to say, my marriage is valid. However, right now at least there are some protections from that Supreme Court decision. There's also some protections from the Supreme Court for trans people, for employment especially. We just had a case on that, I think it was last year, where the Supreme Court decided you cannot discriminate against someone due to their gender identity. But we're still seeing that discrimination across the country, regardless of that decision. They just hide it in other ways now. So that's fun. But we see certain states constantly trying to come after the trans community. And even our own community, the LGBTQ, is not entirely convinced we should be together. Last year, that study, we found that 44.92% of LGBTQ people at least somewhat believe that splitting sexual orientations from gender identities, meaning LGB breaks away from the TQ+, that it would benefit sexual orientations to gain more acceptance. Similarly, 38.15% of LGBTQ at least somewhat think that the split would help gender identities gain more acceptance if it was split from sexual orientations. So a not so insignificant number of our community think that we would be better off on our own. And here is where the far right, the outside world, wants to confuse us on purpose. Basically, to the outside world, you think to yourself, what's easy to understand? Well, it's easy to understand that I love my husband, because love is something we all experience at some point in our lives in some capacity, whether that's, agape love, romantic love, or so on and so forth. No matter what kind of love it is, we experience some form of love in our life. And so it's easy to understand for us, oh, hey, I just love someone different than you love, right? And so that's why we're seeing a lot of the bills across the country coming after other things. Like, no longer, we're seeing some come after the gay community, but for the most part, they're not coming after the gay community because they understand. There was a study done years ago, I believe by Pew Research, that said 80% of Americans that are non-LGBTQ, they are straight and cisgender, believe that gay people should have equal rights and protections under the law. 80%. And so they know their voters would not agree with them coming after the gay community. And so that's really good to see. However, there's a small fraction of people who think that being gay means you're a pedophile. Because years and years ago, the head of the FBI at the time, very terrible man, by the way, I just want to point that out. His name was John Edgar Hoover, right? He wrote this letter that basically attacked gay people. Now, he was a gay man himself, very openly in a relationship with his head secretary guy. So it was kind of weird to see him make a report like this. But he put out an editorial piece stating that basically, from his perspective in the head of the FBI, he was seeing a lot of pedophiles start out as coming out as gay. And it's like, there was zero evidence of this, by the way. Zero evidence. He later told people, hey, there's no evidence of what I wrote here. There was no evidence to say what I said. Most people think he was trying to throw everyone off the trail, trying to attack the gay community because he was gay himself, and he thought, well, if I can, throw people off the scent a little bit, they'll think that I'm straight again or something, which is stupid. Why attack your own community just to prove you're not something that you truly were? That's so dumb to me, because it was a huge detriment to the community for many, many years, including up to now, and we're talking about this 50 years later, right? But that associated us, the gay community, with the MAP community. And so you have that being already confused, and now you add the very conservative audience saying, well, if you're gay, you must want to use different pronouns. You must want to wear a dress now. And it's like, no, that's not. That's gender identity. This is sexual orientation. They're very different things. And look, as someone in my position, being Professor Pride, doing all the years of research I've done, and most of the people I meet in my life, they're all very, very accepting of the entire LGBTQ community. But there are a good number of people who I've met who do think that gay people would have more rights if they weren't always associated by the conservatives with the trans community. And that's difficult to hear. I know it's difficult. That's why we did this study, to figure out how many of you think that we'd be, better off one way or the other, Our community has always been together since day one in this fight. We've, marched with Martin Luther King Jr. We've marched with, women's rights activists, and we've always stood by each other. The reason why lesbian is the first part of the acronym LGBTQ is because lesbians stood by the gay community through the AIDS pandemic, or the AIDS crisis, That's the whole reason why L is first in the acronym, But the trans community is under attack right now. And like it or not, the gay community does have more rights because of the Supreme Court. And so we need to stand by the trans community just like they stood by us back in the 60s and 70s, right? That's sort of where we're at in our community, where we have to stick together in order to get anywhere, right? Because if it was just the trans community fighting for their own rights, the number of trans people is not anywhere near what it has to be to basically force Congress to act, right? You need an overwhelming majority before the American public get anything they want done without lobbyists, right? So it's very difficult to see this happen across the country, but it is, I think, good to see how many of these bills are failing year after year after year. I think that was an important distinction that we had to make here, is that yes, there's 417 so far in February, but that also means 417 failed in 2023. out of the 540. And that's just so far. They could be other bills that are reintroduced later. But for a majority of these bills, they're coming after the trans community. And so, as a gay person, you might be sitting there going, well, at least they're not coming after me. No, they're not coming after you, but they're coming after your community. And in a lot of parts in the country, they're confusing the two to a point where in Florida, they're introducing bills that say we shouldn't be talking about sexual orientations or gender identities. And it's like, wait, hold on a second. You know, for a lot of gay people, that was sort of the moment where everyone thought, oh, this is all over now. We've gotten the right to marry. We've gotten the right to live freely in 2005 because of Lawrence v. Texas ruling by the Supreme Court. You know, we have the right to be gay and be married and everything we need, right? And then sort of the Don't Say Gay law came out in Florida and said, you know, gay people can't exist in any school because, you know, it'd be horrible for our kids to learn a diverse community and to learn that they're perfectly normal for being gay, right? And so that's the moment a lot of people saw that was like, wait a minute, maybe we're not so safe here. We can still be attacked. We can still be discriminated against, right? It happens all the time to gay people still. So this fight is far from over for equal rights and protections under the law. And we're seeing this across the country. We're seeing censorship. We're seeing redefinitions of sex being confused with the LGBTQ community. It's like we see school sports bans. A lot of school sports bans that are happening, they're not just coming after trans people. They're coming after gay people on sports teams because they're afraid that their son or daughter is going to have to interact with a gay kid. It's terrible to think that some people are so afraid of this, but it's happening across the country. We have these debates of trans people in sports, trans people in bathrooms, and we did episodes on them before, covering why these debates are so out there, far stupid. But the fact is, some people believe in them, in these theories that, you know, there's it's great example of this is a friend of mine who just happens to be Republican. I think that, you know, it's perfectly fine to have a couple friends that are opposing viewpoints than you, just to like, because there's other things to talk about other than politics, by the way. But in talking with them, I talked with them about the LGBTQ rights a little bit, and they are 100% convinced in this story that there are litter boxes in a school in Syracuse, New York. Because the far-right hate groups of libs of TikTok made up this entire lie that the furry fandom somehow has, you know, corrupted a school where a kid now identifies not as a different gender, but as an animal. And so they decided to put, and the liberals changed this school's policy to put litter boxes in the bathrooms of this elementary school. So this child who believes they are an animal could go to the restroom. That entire lie ended up where people called the school from across the country. They attacked this school all over, so much so that the principal had to show people, look in all of our restrooms right now. There are no litter boxes. Where in the world did you get this theory from, right? It all comes back to the hate group libs of TikTok. But let's be honest, libs of TikTok have come up with many, many lies over the years. They've been known to send bomb threats to hospitals. They've been known to lie about things and have people commit mass murder in Club Q in Colorado Springs, and then they will go on and celebrate that mass murder later on their website. And it's like, how are these people not in jail, by the way? But, that's besides the point, right? So I don't understand how how freedom of speech protects that so much. However, looking at this situation, people are so convinced now because of that lie and that story that there's litter boxes in this Syracuse school. And so I'll ask my friends about trans rights or something like that, and they'll be convinced that the trans community is now asking for litter boxes. And it's like, where are you getting your facts from? Right? And they'll say, no, I don't listen to Libs of TikTok. No, it doesn't matter. Libs of TikTok reported on it originally, but now it's being reported by Fox News and all these different outlets that blindly just follow hate groups and whatever information they put out, right? And gladly, Fox News will endorse these hate groups online and say, it's such great work you're doing over at Libs of TikTok. They're a hate group. They're a hate group classified by the FBI. What? How are you allowed to have airwaves to say that, right? But the point is, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the legislator of the world are now, or the country, are now following these very confused stories and saying, well, we need to ban trans people from using the restroom because they're asking for litter boxes. It's this just so disconnected world that we live in, where you no longer need facts to make a case for a bill to be introduced in the legislature, right? And so these are just 417 anti-LGBTQ bills in states, not the federal government. There's plenty of anti-LGBTQ bills being introduced in the federal government too. But it's just appalling that we no longer need the facts. We see across the country, House of Representative members or Senate members reading books. I'm sorry, no, not reading the entire book, reading excerpts of books. They'll read an excerpt of a book that's meant for adults. And they'll say, oh, well, we should ban all LGBTQ books in all schools in our state because this book exists online that you can buy for an 18-plus person. Or an 18-year-old person. Yes, so adult books do exist. I should know. I wrote one. It's available on Amazon, right? But that's just one of the many 16 books I've written now, right? And that book is available on Amazon. It's not in school libraries. It's not anywhere that shouldn't be seen, right? Or this book shouldn't be seen in. I have other books, like Shadow's First Pride event, that's in school libraries, which is great. But those are two very different things, and they're on two very different platforms. You have to actively search out that book to find it online. You can't find it at a local library, right? That's just not going to happen. We've seen these excerpts come out in books where they'll read a line and they'll be like, oh my God, how dare you have this in a school library or a public library? It's like, that book wasn't in a public library. It wasn't in a school library. What are you even talking about? It was a book you bought online, right? Or sometimes you'll have a book that's intended for high schoolers that's written about two boys kissing. And then all of a sudden you'll hear, oh, well, our third grade kids shouldn't be reading this. It's like, that's not intended for third graders, okay? Like, a third grader is not going to pick up a 500-page book and go, I'm going to read this, These bills are being introduced to attack our community without really understanding anything about our community, without any facts or evidence that are really backing them up, there are debates to be had on certain issues. That's my point here. There are debates that we could have. Unfortunately, there is no debate when the one side is just basing their entire premise on illogical, not factual information, and they have no way to provide evidence to back it up. They're saying, we should ban gay kids from using the restroom or from talking about their relationships in schools. We should ban trans kids from using the restrooms and being on the sports teams, but there's no evidence on their side to back up these claims. There's debates to be had on some of these. For instance, we should be looking at school libraries. What books are in them? Because there's a lot of books that shouldn't be there. The Bible, for instance, talks about murder on a consistent basis throughout the book, and it's in school libraries. You want to tell me how that's appropriate for a third grader to read? Because I can assure you, in my third grade class in a Roman Catholic elementary school, we had to read that Bible. Okay? I'm just going to say it. So there are things that should be debated on what should be appropriate for what ages, but let's not start that entire conversation without facts and evidence behind the conversation. And let's not start that conversation based on what a hate group says online without providing evidence to back it up. For instance, let's not introduce a bill into the House floor in a certain state saying we shouldn't have, I can't believe I have to say this on a podcast, let's not say in a bill that we should not have litter boxes in our schools for children who identify as pets, because that never happened. Let's maybe not introduce that bill until we have photographic evidence that happened somewhere. Let's just start there. Start with evidence and with facts. That's how we get actual legislation that people need. So, in summary, it's a good thing to see that so many of these bills are failing year after year after year. It's alarming to see the number rise year after year of how many anti-LGBTQ bills are introduced. But keep in mind that only says how many were introduced. And so you might be sitting there today in February saying to yourself, wow, 417 were already introduced by February 14th, 2024. That's a lot in a month and a half to introduce. However, got to keep in mind a majority of them, if not every one of them, I'm recognizing from last year it's just being carried over. If you go to ACLU's website right now of aclu.org/legislative attacks on LGBTQ rights 2024, there are a lot of states that will surprise you. Oklahoma, Missouri, and Iowa all have over 16 bills introduced so far. Tennessee, West Virginia, and South Carolina included in that. New Hampshire included in that. You'll be alarmed, kind of surprised more than anything, that Texas so far has 0 anti-LGBTQ bills even being introduced so far. That's kind of surprising. It's surprising in a good way, by the way. But you can scroll down through this list. A lot of these bills are the same as last year, and they even say status introduced carried over, which means it was carried over from 2023 legislative year. So it's really good to see that they're just being carried over year after year after year, which means this country's starting to become a little less anti-LGBTQ, a little bit less homophobic and transphobic. At least on the legislative side, yes, these things are being introduced, but they're not passing, which is always a win for us. There's going to be homophobes and transphobes on the legislature. There are going to be homophobes and transphobes in public, but they're not winning. The millions of dollars they're spending on advertising, the millions of dollars they're spending on, trying to infiltrate Moms for Liberty or trying to infiltrate school boards. Yes, it's alarming, but they're not winning all the fights they think they're winning. So that's at least good to see, and we have to keep track of these as we advance through the year to see how many are actually passing and how many are carried over into the next year. Because honestly, I'm very happy to see that so many of these are being carried over, because it means they didn't pass last year, which means someone on that legislator, at least one person on that legislator, didn't think these were right to pass. So that's all for today. Make sure to check out ProfessorPride.com for all of your Pride merchandise that you're going to need for this year's Pride, including buttons, hats, plenty of stickers, magnets. We have cloth fans. We just have a ton of stuff over there. There's digital downloads, LGBTQ books if you're, trying to help one of your friends or loved ones understand more about our community. Our books are a great way to do that. If your library or your school wants to, have some LGBTQ inclusion, you definitely want one of our books over at ProfessorPride.com. Go get it now and enjoy your entire Valentine's Day week here. But don't be alarmed as much as they want to scare you of all these bills are coming up. Yeah, they're coming up, but they failed last year. So that's good to see. Always look on the bright side, and that's my main point today. So have a great day, everyone, and I will see you hopefully next week on the next Professor Pride podcast. Tune in then. Bye for now.